A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Geberer.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Verkauften Schabbat, es ist Gitter.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Grab a bottle of vodka. We're going to have a little Farbrengen, the 25th anniversary of the Histalkus of the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, and it doesn't happen without a bissel l'chaim. So that's definitely the way to begin. This is Yehuda Geberer with another Jewish History Soundbites podcast, a special Motzei Shabbos one in honor of Gimel Tammuz, and a special Gimel Tammuz as it's the 25th Yahrtzeit since the Histalkus of the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, the last Rebbe of Chabad. And once I mentioned the mashke, the l'chaim, the vodka, which is so prominent by all Farbrengens, so why is it so prominent? Why is that such a major component? And the Rebbe himself once explained that he said several reasons, but say one of them, which is one of my more favorite ones, personally, that when you come, you see a sign up in shul, there's going to be a Farbrengen for some Yahrtzeit or for some event, and we're going to teach Chassidus, we're going to sing a little bit. So the Nefesh Ha'elikis wants to go to the Farbrengen, the higher, more spiritual nefesh that a person is possessed of wants to go to the Farbrengen because he wants to grow in Avodas Hashem. And the Nefesh HaBahamis says, hey, I don't want to go. I'm not interested in learning Chassidus. I'm not interested in Avodas Hashem. So you tell the Nefesh HaBahamis, they're serving some good mashke there, some good vodka. There'll be some nice l'chaims by the Farbrengen. And then the Nefesh HaBahamis wants to go. So it's a way to convince the Nefesh HaBahamis to come along to the Farbrengen to learn Chassidus, and therefore the mashke is a major component of the Hasidic gathering. And the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, was arguably the most influential, or one of the most influential rabbinical leaders in the post-war era in the world. And for someone who was born in Nikolaev, deep in the Pale of Settlement in the Ukraine, an Einikul the Tzemach Tzedek, grows up in a Russian city, Ukrainian city, which I'll definitely pronounce wrong because I find it impossible to pronounce these Ukrainian cities correctly, but something along the lines of Yekaterinslav. And he becomes this incredibly influential leader later on. So how does that all happen? The first thing is to clarify whether it's the last Rebbe of Chabad or the last Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the terms seem to be used interchangeably, and the reason is because after the Lubavitcher Rebbe's ancestor, the Tzemach Tzedek, the original Rabbi Menachem Mendel, after he passed away in 1866, and it was actually a very harrowing month in the Hasidic world, because in 1 month in 1866, the 3 great Rebbes of Hasidus, one in Russia and 2 in Poland, the Tiferes Shlomo of Radomsk, the Chidushei Harim of Ger, and the Tzemach Tzedek of Chabad, all passed away within a month, and it was a devastating blow for Hasidus. And in Chabad, it was a big blow because the Tzemach Tzedek was a tremendous leader. He was a very dynamic and powerful leader. He brought Lubavitch to its peak. Lubavitch was the town where the Tzemach Tzedek's father-in-law, the Mittler Rebbe, the second Rebbe of Chabad, had moved to. And it's interesting that it's called Lubavitch, and out of the 7 Rebbes who are known as the Lubavitcher Rebbes, only 4 of them lived in Lubavitch itself. The first Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, did not live in Lubavitch. He lived in Lozhna and then in Liadi, and he died in Haditch, running away from Napoleon, and which, I bring groups to pilgrimage all the way out to Haditch to go to the Alter Rebbe in the Ukraine. And then the last 2, the Frierdiker Rebbe and the last Rebbe of Chabad, also were not in Lubavitch. So the Tzemach Tzedek brings Lubavitch to its peak as a center of Hasidus in Russia. And when he dies, he has 6 sons, and several of them start their own little chutzers of Chabad. It splits into several. And there's Chabad of Liadi, there's Chabad of Kapust, there's Chabad of, eventually later on, of Babroisk, there's a Chabad of Ovrich, which is more like a Chernobyl chutzer. There's of Nizhin, of where actually the Mittler Rebbe was buried, also in the Ukraine, also bring groups to. And there's different branches of Chabad, and actually, interestingly enough, Kapust is a major branch for many years, and somewhat even more dominant than Lubavitch. Lubavitch goes down in its prominence under the Rebbe Maharash, who's the youngest child of the Tzemach Tzedek. I think I said 6, that might have been a mistake. I think they actually had 7 sons, to double check that. And even after the Maharash passes on, the Rebbe Rashab, the 5th Rebbe of Chabad, only brings back the prominence to Lubavitch when he really takes the reins of leadership in the 1890s, 1894 approximately, and he really doesn't bring Lubavitch back to its real prominence until he opens the yeshivas Tomchei Tmimim in 1897, which is a truly historical event. The Tomchei Tmimim yeshiva changed Hasidus, it changed Chabad, it changed Russian Jewry. It was a major movement, the Tomchei Tmimim yeshiva, and it really brought the center back to Lubavitch under the Rebbe Rashab, who was a very, very powerful and strong leader of Chabad, also close with many of the Litvischer Rabbanim of his day. He was very close to Chaim Eiser Grudzinski and others. Interestingly enough, the Tzemach Tzedek, who I mentioned before, he was the first one to officially meet with what was then called the Misnagdik camp. He met Rebbitzela of Volozhin in St. Petersburg when the 2 of them were both trying to intercede at the Tsarist government on behalf of Russian Jewry to implement educational reform. And they saw that they were both coming for the same purpose, and they realized that it might not be so kedai at this point to invest in working separately, but rather to start working together. And that was the beginning of a different type of a relationship between the Hasidic camp and the non-Hasidic so-called Misnagdik camp. In any event, going back to the splits in Chabad, so there's all types of Chabads, and Lubavitch only comes back to prominence at the turn of the century. So there is the idea of the Chabad Hasidus, and then there's the idea of Lubavitch, and it finally comes back to be synonymous, one and the same, in the early years of the 20th century, but really not completely till after World War I and the Russian Revolution, and the assuming of the role of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Yahrtzeit, the last Rebbe of Chabad's father-in-law. And then it becomes synonymous again. So today Chabad is Lubavitch, Lubavitch is Chabad, and the other branches don't really have any prominence in today's day and age. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe is born into that world. He eventually marries the second daughter of the Frierdiker Rebbe, of the previous Rebbe, the Yahrtzeit, Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson, and they get married in Warsaw. They eventually live there for about a year later on in the 1930s. So they get married in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. This is after the Rebbe himself and his father-in-law and his family had left the Soviet Union, which is a whole story in itself. that's for another time. And he had, besides for going to yeshivas and having private malamdim, he also attended different universities. He had been in the Leningrad University under the communist Russians. He later studied in Berlin, much later on in Paris, and he had a quite an extensive university education. He was very, very smart, very wide range of knowledge of Torah, Beniglo, Benister, and Chassidus, and also in secular knowledge, eventually getting the official degree of being an engineer, specifically an electrical engineer in France. That's something I'll get to in a second. He did live for one short period of time near his father-in-law in Warsaw. His father-in-law had some wanderings after he escaped from the Soviet Union, first in Riga, then he visited America, Eretz Yisrael, and he comes back to Europe, and he comes to Warsaw, then later Otvatsk. But mostly his son-in-law, his second son-in-law, who later became the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he settles down in Berlin with his wife, and he escapes from Berlin when the Nazis come to power, and he moves to Paris, being there until again the Nazis come to power, in which case he has to be on the run again. All this time he keeps a very low profile. In essence, and this is the amazing paradox of someone who is so influential and such a public persona and leader, and his influence reached the highest political circles and all different countries worldwide, and he himself in his personal life was a very private person, a very low profile. He was an edel personality and in his private life. And in his younger years, one saw it as he kept a very quiet profile. He wasn't next to his father-in-law. His older brother-in-law, Shmaryahu Guraria, was the one in the Chutzner of Chabad in Warsaw and in Otvatsk, and even before that in Russia. And he was the major player, the one that was the recognized figure as the Rayatz's right-hand man. And he was further away, keeping in touch by correspondence and visits, and doing his own thing. Interestingly enough, this is a feature that never left him. When later on, and it is well known, he never had any children, unfortunately. And when his wife, Rebbe Chaya Mushka, passed away, he would be more reserved into himself. So much so that the Seder night, which in Chabad and all the shluchim are making these huge sdarim around the world, the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself had the Seder himself. He sat in his room, did the Seder himself, and that's how private he was. And his Gabayim, his Meshamshim would beg him to join, or at least allow them to join with their families. And he'd say, no, it's fine, I'm happy, it's okay, I'm doing it myself. And it's interesting that he kept this again, in a paradox, he kept this private side to him as well throughout his life, besides for being a very public persona. So he escapes again from the Nazis when the Nazis come to France in June 1940, and he goes to southern France. He's registered at the time as an engineer in Paris and later in southern France, and that's what he wants to keep, this low profile, this quietness to him, being tzanua. But something happens at that point, and possibly it was the upheaval of the war and the beginning of the Nazi occupation and seeing what the Jewish people were going through and the exile that he himself is going through. And he goes through some sort of cheshbon nefesh, and it's definitely not clear 100% what caused him to make this decision, but he decides to make a turnaround in his life and decides to take a leadership role in Klal Yisrael, a rabbinical role in Klal Yisrael, and he realizes that the times and the changing times and the tragic times are calling on him to take a more outspoken role and decisive role for the future of Kvod Shemayim and for the Jewish people. And that's an interesting change that takes place during those months when he's trying to escape Europe. And it's not so simple to escape Europe at that point. It's under Nazi occupation. He's in Vichy, France, which is collaborating with the Nazi government. And how is he going to get out? His younger brother-in-law, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, and his wife don't get out. And in fact, he and his wife, the youngest daughter and son-in-law of the previous Rebbe, were killed by the Nazis. So it wasn't so simple to get out. And what complicated things was that he couldn't get a rabbinical visa because he was registered as an engineer. So they couldn't establish that he's a rabbi and needed in America. So they tried to bring him in as part of the Rebbe's family. And the previous Rebbe and Rosh Mariel Gurari and their families had already gotten out. They had gotten to New York already the previous year, and now they're trying to get him out. So they somehow convinced the American government to issue him a visa. So that hurdle is overcome, despite the fact that he's not considered and registered as a rabbi. They're still able to convince him that he's needed as part of the Rebbe's family. And the second hurdle is to get him ship tickets. And interestingly enough, my wife's family, one of her ancestors was a fellow who had ship tickets in order to get his in-laws out. And his in-laws were stuck in Antwerp, which was already under Nazi occupation. He was trying to get them to go leave Antwerp, get to southern France, and get on these ship tickets that he had prepared for them. They were unable to leave Antwerp, and unfortunately they were killed by the Nazis in Auschwitz, which happened obviously later on, but he realized that they were unable to leave, and now he has these ship tickets, which might be one of the last ships to leave, civilian ships to leave across the Atlantic from occupied France, and him being a close with the Rebbe's family, with Chabad. He was affiliated with Chabad to a certain extent. This great-grandfather of my wife gave the tickets to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I always like saying how the Lubavitcher Rebbe and his wife owe their lives, and the world owes the fact that they had the Lubavitcher Rebbe afterwards, the war, that he wasn't stuck behind by the Nazis because of my wife's great-grandfather. So that's ultimately to his credit. Even after he arrives in America, and he arrives at one of the last out. He arrives in the summer of 1941, talking about deep into the Nazi occupation, about a year after the Nazis came to France, talking about pretty deep into the war. He arrives in America, and even there he keeps quite a low profile by his father-in-law. Rabbi Shmario Gurari is still the dominant son-in-law. His father-in-law gives him more and more jobs. He becomes in charge of the Merkaz Linyonei Chinuch and then the Kahas Publishing. And the Rebbe starts making small farbrengens for the younger Hasidim to attract them and bring them closer to Hasidus. And then on Yud Shvat, Tafshin Yud, 1950, the previous Rebbe, the Rayatz, passes away. And now the question is who's going to become the new Rebbe. And there's a little bit of a question amongst the Hasidim, amongst the family, who becomes, and ultimately it took a full year, and without getting too bogged down by the details, eventually the Hasidim crown the Rebbe, the Rabbi Menachem Mendel, the second son-in-law, the Rebbe. Eventually Rabbi Shmael Gurari himself accepts the Rebbe. He attends the Farbrengens of the Rebbe. He gives his famous first mimer on that Yahrtzeit of his father-in-law, of Basi Legani, which became legendary in Chabad circles. And he consolidates his position as the Rebbe, which wasn't so simple at first. There were people who voiced their protests. How is he taking over his father-in-law's position? His own mother-in-law wasn't so excited about it. Other people in the Hasidus, his father-in-law's Gabbai, wasn't too happy about it, Chaim Lieberman. And there were voices of protest, but it took some time, and he was able to consolidate his control and his leadership in the movement. Once he becomes the Rebbe, he has a very interesting practice, which almost no Rebbe in the history of Hasidus practiced, that he never left New York. He almost never left New York City. Went a couple of times to the Catskills to the Chabad camp, but that's about it. He pretty much never leaves New York City, but everyone comes to him. Everyone eventually comes to him. And from all types, all backgrounds, religious, secular, Jewish, non-Jewish, politicians, rabbis, simple people, celebrities, every possible person finds their way to him. And really an interesting diversity. And he sends people out. He continues what his father-in-law started, but he brings it to a whole new level. The Shluchim, the Chabad Shliach, who's become such a dominant feature of those who travel abroad, and I myself, when I bring the groups to all these parts of Eastern Europe, we always encounter the Chabad Shlichim, and they, help us out, obviously, with food and other stuff that we need, and always like to hear a little bit about what's going on in the local Jewish community from them, so we definitely encounter them at their work. And it starts from him. And interestingly enough, he starts it and he continues it from his father-in-law, and he expands it. And obviously there's many different influences. Primarily, he takes the dictum of the Baal Shem Tov that Yafutzu Ma'inasecha Chutza, that the ideas of Yiddishkeit, of Torah and mitzvahs, and of course later on also Hasidus, have to be spread out to the four corners of the world in order for Mashiach to come. He takes it quite literally, like unlike anyone in the history of Hasidus had ever taken it. He takes it very, very literally. But beyond that, one of the outside influences that he had, and he actually spoke about this at a Farbrengen once, was the Peace Corps. When JFK announces in the early 60s that he's starting the Peace Corps, that he's going to send out young American students out to Samoa and anywhere in the Pacific and all these funny places and islands and all across the world to teach the natives English and to bring them all types of great things from American culture. He spoke about it at Farbrengen. He was very inspired by it. And he said, these young people are going to, go out in the middle of nowhere where there's no infrastructure and there's no community and they don't have any other backing. And they're going to go spread values that they believe is the correct values to spread. And look at that. Look at these young people, what they're capable of doing. And he got a lot of inspiration from the Peace Corps, which is fascinating that he's able to take the influence from the outside and he's able to give his influence on wide circles, even beyond the Jewish people, even on the non-Jewish people. And I just want to end off with a very interesting, it's the day of his Histalkus, it's a Yahrtzeit, but interesting, one of the things that he incorporated into Jewish life was the celebration of birthdays, which had never been a part of Jewish life. The Torah records that Paroi had birthdays. It wasn't really a Jewish thing so much to celebrate birthdays. And he said we should celebrate birthdays. And it was one of the things that he added and encouraged people to do. And I think even though it seems to be a minor point in his illustrious career as a leader and the influence that he had, but this really brings out a certain point. He said, you know why you need to celebrate a birthday? Because on this day, the day that you were born, is the day that Hashem decided that the world cannot exist without you. And that's a day to celebrate. It's a day to realize your responsibilities in the world. That this is a day that Hashem said, the world cannot go on without you. The world needs you and your contribution. And that's an amazing lesson. And that's a lesson that he really tried to impart to everyone, that everyone's needed and everyone can be reached, and we need to reach everyone. So that's a little bit about the Lubavitcher Rebbe and his leadership. This was Yehuda Geberer on Jewish History Soundbites. You can subscribe now to Jewish History Soundbites on iTunes, Google Play, or Spotify. Don't miss an episode. You can also reach me at ygebss@gmail.com for questions, comments, sources, and of course to take tours to all these amazing places and hear about these people. Share with your friends and family. You can follow Jewish History Soundbites on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.